Hey reptile fans, did you know that there's over 1,500 different species of geckos out there? Now I could talk about the top 5 geckos, but we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about the top 5 small geckos out there. Why small geckos instead of large geckos? Well, because small geckos are cooler than large geckos. And I'm going to tell you why and share my favorite 5 small geckos with you in just a moment. You know what that means, Poppy Seed? That means that you're not going to be in this video. Join me. Why are we focusing today on small geckos instead of large reptiles like bearded dragons or ball pythons or chameleons or even large geckos? Well, it's easy. They can be kept comfortably in small enclosures. Most often have more interesting behaviors than larger animals, and especially the small geckos on this list are just simply easier to take care of. Now, I don't want anyone calling a foul on me, so let's talk about the criteria. The first is size. We're talking about small geckos. That's 4 inches or less. So bye-bye leopard geckos, bye-bye crested geckos, bye-bye poppy seed. The second criteria is accessibility. You have to be able to find these geckos in the hobby. So that means we're not going to be talking about Paroedura androyensis, one of my all-time favorite geckos. We're not going to be talking about Pictus Gecko, the scorpion tail gecko. We're not going to be talking about an Australian gecko, Nephurus levis. We're not going to be talking about the helmeted geckos. And we're not going to be talking about another one of my favorites, Lygodactylus kimhowelli. Hey, take a look at these satanic geckos. Aren't they cool? Well, they're off the list too because our third criteria is easy to keep. And satanics are known to be a little bit more difficult to keep. As we go through this list, comment down below if you keep any of these geckos or if you have another gecko that should have been on this list that I missed. Number 5 on our list is the barking gecko. This is Nephurus meli. Now some will classify it as Underwoodosaurus meli. I don't know anymore. Let's spin the wheel.
What?
These geckos are from the land down under Australia. They're referred to as knobtail geckos, even though there's more pronounced knobtail geckos in the hobby. These don't really have that much of a knobtail. These small Australian geckos are fascinating, but unlike the other knobtails, these are affordable and they're very handleable. For care, they like a longer enclosure. They're terrestrial, so a 10-gallon to 20 long would just be perfect for these animals. The substrate should be a combination of dirt, peat moss, and sand so it doesn't compact down too much. You can put a heat mat underneath to keep one area of the enclosure around 90 to 95 degrees, or you can put a heat emitter on top of the enclosure. Make sure you have a food dish, a water dish, and lots of hides. Now this gecko is an insectivore. They love mealworms, crickets, hornworms, waxworms, any kind of moving insects that you can put into the enclosure. And why are they number 5 on our list? Well, that's easy because they're handleable, they're easy to care for, and oh my gosh, look how cute these animals are. Number 4, Coleonyx variegatus. This is the western banded gecko. Now these geckos are super underrated. I heard recently that a European breeder that couldn't get the animals out of America paid $1,000 for a pair recently. This is in the group called banded geckos. There's 8 different species, but really there's only 3, maybe 4 in the hobby right now. The one that we're talking about today, Coleonyx variegatus, my favorite because of their size and the ease of care. This is another terrestrial animal that will do great in 20 long enclosures. Set them up with a sand substrate.
What?
Yes, I said sand. I've never had an impaction issue with these geckos, but make sure that you have hides all over the place, including the hot and cool side. Their temperatures are just like the Nephurus meli that we just talked about. 90 degrees on the warm side, and the rest of the enclosure can be an ambient temperature of mid-70s. But most important with these animals is make sure that you have a humid hide somewhere in the enclosure. Give them 2 if you can. Coleonyx variegatus just absolutely loves crickets, and they'll take mealworms, small dubias, hornworms, waxworms, whatever kind of feeder that you can give them. Now here's something really cool with these animals. If you can find out the actual location of the animals that you purchased, that would be great because all the locations have a little bit of a different color or patterning to these animals. Oh, by the way, that $1,000 for the pair of Coleonyx variegatus paid in Europe, I kind of made that up, but they should be kept more in the hobby because they are so underrated. The next animal is an absolute hobby favorite. It's Hemidactylus imbricatus. Now these are better known as the viper geckos or turnip-tailed geckos. I don't really like the term turnip tails. Then why did I even mention that? These geckos are absolutely small. Let's go ahead and take a look. There they are. Can you see them? Let's pull back a little bit with the camera and let's see if we can see them a little bit better. Now, I found this on the interweb where somebody said that they grow up to 4 inches long. If anybody has a viper gecko that's 4 inches long, send me a picture. I want to see that animal. Hemidactylus imbricatus, the viper gecko, comes from a region of the Middle East, especially in Pakistan. Because of that, they like warmer enclosures. You can actually set them up just like I described the Coleonyx variegatus, but you don't need to put a humid hide in their enclosure. Let's talk about the foods for these geckos. You can feed them mealworms and crickets, but they have to be small. 1/8 inch crickets, 1/4 inch mealworms at the most. Oh, and if you can find baby dubias, they love them. One of the absolute challenges with this animal is when you have babies, finding the right foods for the babies. We'll go ahead and feed them micro mealworms, fruit flies, and even dwarf white isopods. That's really the only challenge with this gecko, or else it would be way higher on this list. Let's talk about number 2. And our number 2 animal is Urodactyloides agricolae. I think a lot of you probably knew that this animal would be somewhere on our small gecko list. Why is it number 2? Well, look how handleable this is. This is called the Chameleon Gecko because they change colors so easily. I like to call them the dinosaur gecko. They have a super unique movement and look to them. These geckos come from New Caledonia and they're easy to keep because they eat the crested gecko diet. Again, handleability is about 9 out of 10 for these geckos. And guess what? They're not terrestrial, they're arboreals. They like to climb, so they're very easy to set up in an enclosure. And just like crested geckos, no special lighting, no special heat. They benefit from UVB. They eat the diet like I mentioned, and they're actually easy to breed. You should see the babies. They're so cute. These are really gaining in popularity, folks, in the hobby. Let's talk about number 1. And the number 1 small gecko on my list is... Wait a second, you have to guess. Did you put a comment down below? What's my number 1 gecko? Well, if you watch this channel enough, you probably already know what my number 1 small gecko is. Without a doubt, it's Paroedura picta, or Pictus Gecko. They have so many common names. Ocellated gecko, Madagascar ground gecko, fat-headed gecko, Malagasy fat-tailed gecko, panther gecko. I've even heard some people call them Ralph. And this is another terrestrial gecko. So you can refer down to the Nephurus meli setup information that I provided because you can set them up exactly the same. But here's something really cool about these geckos. You can either set them up in a tropical enclosure or you can set them up in an arid enclosure with sand. Whichever one that you do, make sure that you have a lot of hides down by the bottom of the enclosure. Did I mention that these are super handleable? I think it's just getting the warmth from my hand and just loving it. Just sitting there chilling. Now here's my favorite part about this gecko, and the reason that I put it as number 1 is the breeding of this gecko. Super easy, but oh my gosh, the colors and the patterns and the variety that you get from these animals is unbelievable. Stripes, reticulateds, reds, whites, 3 stripes, albinos or T+ albinos. Unbelievable. For those that know me, you knew this was going to be my number 1 small gecko, didn't you? In fact, it's probably my number 1 gecko of all time, and I've kept hundreds of different species of geckos. The thing is, even after watching this video and learning so much about these small geckos, especially Paroedura picta, I know you want to learn even more. And believe it or not, you can watch this playlist right here and learn even more about Paroedura picta. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you next video.